Think about the last time you waited for something that never came. Not the small waits. Not the coffee line or the delayed flight. The real ones. The ones where you had done everything right. Prepared everything. Built everything you were supposed to build. And then sat in a room where nothing happened. Where the door did not open. Where the phone did not ring. Where the world outside kept moving. And you kept waiting, and the waiting had no end. You could see from where you were sitting. Now, make that wait 1 billion years. That is what this story is about. Somewhere around 1.8 billion years ago, Earth had already survived things that the planet had been struck by objects large enough to vaporize oceans. It had frozen, partially or completely. More than once. It had watched its own atmosphere get poisoned by the waste product of the first organisms to figure out how to eat sunlight. And then it had survived that too. By 1.8 billion years ago, life existed. It had existed for more than 2 billion years. And not primitive. Accidental. Barely their life. Life that had already invented photosynthesis. Life that had already learned to use oxygen as fuel. Life that had already produced the eukaryotic cell. The kind of cell with a nucleus. The kind that every animal and plant and fungus on Earth is made of today. The ingredients were there. The chemistry was there. The time was there. And for the next billion years, almost nothing happened. No explosion of complexity. No sudden diversification. No animals. No forests. No eyes. No brains. No bodies larger than what you would need a microscope to see. Life sat at the edge of becoming something enormous. And the world held it there. Just at that edge. For longer than the human mind can honestly feel. Scientists have a name for this period. They call it the boring billion. It runs roughly from 1.8 billion years ago to 800 million years ago. And the name is not an insult. It is a geological observation. When you look at the rock record from this period, the chemical signatures, the isotope ratios, the sediment layers, you find something that looks almost like repetition, like a song stuck on the same note. Like a planet that had wound itself into a kind of stability so deep and so self-reinforcing that it could not break out. But here is what the name gets wrong. Boring is what you call something from the outside. When you are inside it, when you are the thing waiting, when you are the life running its experiments in an ocean that will not give you what you need. There is nothing boring about it. There is only the waiting and the trying and the slow, invisible work of building something the world is not yet ready to use. For 1 billion years, Earth had life, but it would not let life grow. The question is why? And the answer is stranger, and more important than the name suggests. Here is something worth sitting with before we go any further. By the time the boring billion begins, life on Earth is already ancient. When 1.8 billion years ago arrives on the calendar of Earth history, life has already been running on this planet for more than 2 billion years. All of recorded civilization, every empire and every war and every city ever built, fits inside the last 10,000 years. The life that already existed when the boring billion began had been evolving, competing, dying, and adapting for 200 times that length of time. It had not been idle. 4 billion years ago, when Earth was still being bombarded by the debris of its own formation, when the surface was a chaos of volcanic rock and shallow seas and an atmosphere with no free oxygen, something appeared that could copy itself. We do not know exactly how. The origin of life remains one of the deepest unsolved questions in all of science. But something appeared, and it persisted, and it began the long work of changing everything around it. By 3.5 billion years ago, stromatolites were already building layered mats in shallow coastal waters. By 2.7 billion years ago, cyanobacteria had invented oxygenic photosynthesis, the ability to split water molecules using sunlight and release oxygen as a byproduct. That single invention was the most consequential act of chemistry any organism has ever performed on this planet. It took 300 million years to fully saturate the chemical buffers of the early ocean. But by 2.4 billion years ago, oxygen was accumulating in the atmosphere for the first time. The world did not welcome it. The Great Oxygenation Event was, for most of the organisms alive at the time, a catastrophe. The organisms that had built their entire metabolic systems around an oxygen-free world were suddenly living in an atmosphere that was slowly becoming toxic to them. Most retreated. Some disappeared. The anaerobic world that had existed for 2 billion years was pushed into corners, into deep sediments, into the cold, dark places where oxygen could not reach. And in its place, a new world began to form. Oxygen is not just a gas, it is a fuel. Organisms that learned to use it for respiration gained access to an energy source so much more powerful than anything available before that the comparison barely makes sense. Aerobic respiration extracts roughly 18 times more energy from a molecule of glucose than fermentation does. 18 times. In a world where energy is the fundamental currency of everything an organism can build and sustain and do, that is not a marginal advantage. It is a transformation. Then, somewhere between 2.1 and 1.8 billion years ago, the eukaryotic cell appeared. The eukaryotic cell is the cell that everything complex is made of. It has a nucleus, a membrane-bound compartment holding the genetic material separate from the rest of the cell's activity. It has mitochondria, the descendants of ancient bacteria that were engulfed and not digested, turned instead into internal power generators that run on oxygen. It has a level of internal organization that makes a bacterial cell look like a room with a dirt floor compared to a building with a full electrical system. The eukaryotic cell is the architectural foundation of every animal, every plant, every fungus that has ever lived on Earth. And it existed already before the boring billion began. So step back and look at what was on the table 1.8 billion years ago. Oxygen in the atmosphere, aerobic metabolism available as an energy source, the eukaryotic cell already invented, already present, already carrying within it the mitochondrial machinery that would power every complex organism that came after. 2 billion years of evolutionary refinement, already done by any logic. This should have been the moment. The conditions for complexity were in place. The engine had been built. The fuel was available. And then the billion years of almost nothing began. The rock record from this period tells a story that geologists spent decades trying to explain. Carbon isotope ratios, which fluctuate significantly when large biological and chemical changes are happening, go quiet. They move within a narrow band, shifting slightly, but returning, again and again, to the same values. Sulfur chemistry in ancient sediments shows a similar pattern. Oxygen levels in the atmosphere, based on proxies in ancient rock, stay low, enough to support simple life, far below what they would eventually become, locked in a range that was not enough to power the complex life that all the other ingredients seemed to be pointing toward. A revolution that had been building for 2 billion years arrived at the edge of something enormous, and then it stopped. The question geologists began asking, And the question this story is going to follow is whether the boring billion was a failure or a preparation, whether the stability of that billion years was the planet falling short of what it could have been, or whether it was the planet doing something necessary, something that had to happen exactly as slowly as it happened for what came after to be possible. The answer is not what you would expect. But to find it, we have to start with the rock itself. Because before we can understand what the boring billion meant, we have to understand what it looked like. And what it looked like is one of the most quietly unsettling things in the geological record. It looked like nothing was happening. And that, as it turns out, is the most interesting thing of all. There is a cliff face in northern Australia that has been there for so long that the concept of old does not quite apply to it anymore. The MacArthur Basin in the Northern Territory holds some of the best preserved rock sequences from the boring billion anywhere on Earth. If you stood in front of one of those exposed sections and ran your hand along the layers, you would feel the compressed residue of hundreds of millions of years of ocean floor, sediment laid down in shallow seas that no longer exist, under a sky that no longer has the chemistry it had then, above a seafloor that has since been folded and uplifted and eroded into the red Australian landscape you see today. What you would not feel is drama. The layers are there. They are real. They are ancient in a way that makes the word ancient feel inadequate. But they do not tell a story of catastrophe or sudden change, or the kind of events that leave a mark so clear that a scientist can point to it and say, "Here, this is where everything shifted." They tell a story of repetition, of a world that kept doing the same things, in roughly the same ways, for longer than most events in Earth history last. Geologists read rock the way a doctor reads a chart. The chemistry of ancient sediment carries information about the conditions under which it was deposited. Carbon isotopes tell you about biological productivity and the carbon cycle. Sulfur isotopes tell you about ocean chemistry and the presence or absence of oxygen in the water. Iron chemistry tells you about the redox state of the deep ocean. Trace metal concentrations tell you about nutrient availability and whether oxygen was present to mobilize those metals or absent to keep them locked away. When you read those charts for the boring billion, the pattern that emerges is one that took the scientific community a long time to name, partly because naming it required admitting something that felt almost embarrassing. The charts are flat, not completely, not in a way that means nothing was happening at all, but flat in the way that a heart monitor is flat when the patient is stable, when nothing is going wrong, but nothing is particularly going right either. The carbon isotope record for the mid-Proterozoic stays within a range that, compared to the dramatic swings seen in the periods before and after, looks almost like a straight line. The sulfur record is similar. The iron record is similar. The proxies for atmospheric oxygen show values that stay consistently low, not trending upward the way they would eventually trend, not crashing downward either, just hovering in a range that says the same thing every time you check it. Nothing is changing very much. For a billion years. The physicist's word for a system that keeps returning to the same state no matter what you do to it is stable. The ecologist's word for an ecosystem that resists change is resilient. The geologist's word for a rock record that shows almost no variation across hundreds of millions of years is, apparently, boring. But here is what took decades of careful work to understand. The flatness of that record is not absence of information. It is information. A planet does not stay chemically stable for a billion years by accident. Stability on that timescale requires something actively maintaining it. A set of feedbacks and buffers and interlocking systems that respond to any perturbation by pushing back toward the equilibrium. The boring rock record is not evidence that nothing was happening. It is evidence that every time something tried to happen, something else stopped it. Think about what that means. Every time oxygen levels began to rise, some part of the planetary system absorbed the excess before it could accumulate. Every time biological productivity increased and more organic carbon was being buried, the feedback through weathering and volcanism adjusted to compensate. Every time the chemistry of the ocean began to shift in a direction that might have opened new ecological possibilities, the same interlocking systems of sulfur and iron and carbon cycling pulled it back. The boring billion was not a world in which nothing was trying to change. It was a world in which every attempt at change was being cancelled. The mechanism at the heart of this cancellation is what geochemists call the carbon-oxygen feedback system, and following it requires a brief detour into planetary plumbing. Oxygen in Earth's atmosphere comes primarily from photosynthesis, specifically from the burial of organic carbon. When a photosynthetic organism takes carbon dioxide and sunlight and builds sugar, it produces oxygen as a byproduct. Most of the time, when that organism dies, the organic carbon in its body gets oxidized back to carbon dioxide, and the net effect on atmospheric oxygen is zero. The oxygen produced is consumed again. The system is balanced. But sometimes, organic carbon gets buried before it can be oxidized. It sinks to the sea floor and gets covered by sediment and removed from contact with oxygen. When that happens, the oxygen that was produced during photosynthesis does not get consumed. It accumulates. This is how oxygen built up in Earth's atmosphere in the first place, through the slow and long burial of organic carbon over billions of years. The problem, during the boring billion, is that the rate of burial was being counteracted by other processes at almost exactly the same rate it was occurring. Volcanic outgassing was releasing reduced gases that consumed oxygen. Weathering of ancient, unoxidized rock was pulling oxygen out of the atmosphere. The deep ocean, still largely anoxic, was a vast chemical sink that absorbed any oxygen that diffused into it from above. The system was in balance, a tight, self-regulating, deeply entrenched balance that had been operating long enough to develop the kind of stability that is very hard to break. And the reason that matters, the reason it is worth understanding this planetary accounting in some detail, is that the organisms living inside that balanced system were not passive passengers. They were participants. The same biological productivity that was producing oxygen was also, through the complex feedbacks of nutrient cycling and carbon burial and ocean chemistry, helping to maintain the very stability that was limiting them. Life was helping to build its own cage. That is a strange thing to sit with. The cyanobacteria and the early eukaryotes of the boring billion were not trying to limit themselves. They were doing what organisms do, extracting energy from the available environment, reproducing, competing, adapting. But the cumulative effect of their activity, channeled through the geochemical systems of a planet that had evolved to maintain equilibrium, was to reinforce the conditions that prevented any of them from becoming something larger. There is a concept in economics called a low-level equilibrium trap. It describes a situation where a system is stable, where all the forces acting on it are balanced, but where the equilibrium point is far below what the system could theoretically achieve. The system is succeeding at staying where it is. The trap is not a cage with walls you can see. It is a balance point so stable that moving away from it requires a disruption large enough to overcome all the forces pulling back toward the center. The boring billion was Earth's low-level equilibrium trap. Life had enough oxygen to survive, enough nutrients to reproduce, enough stability to persist across hundreds of millions of years without being wiped out, but not enough of anything to grow beyond the limits that the balance itself was imposing. The rock record is flat because the trap was working, and understanding the trap requires going to where the trap was tightest, into the ocean, where the specific and physical and chemical reality of what life was dealing with becomes something you can almost touch. The boring billion ocean was unlike anything that exists on Earth today. It was a world unto itself, with its own rules, its own chemistry, its own particular way of being, inhospitable to everything that wanted to grow beyond what it permitted. To understand why life stayed small, you have to understand the water it was living in, and that water was stranger than most people have ever imagined. Take a breath, not as an instruction, as a reminder of what you are doing right now without thinking about it. Your lungs are expanding. Your diaphragm is pulling down. Air is moving through passages you have never consciously controlled, into spaces you have never seen, across membranes thin enough that individual molecules can cross them. And on the other side of those membranes, oxygen is entering your bloodstream at a concentration that your body has been calibrated over hundreds of millions of years of evolution to expect. That concentration is approximately 21% of the atmosphere. Now imagine it is 1%. 1% is enough to breathe. Barely enough. At 1% atmospheric oxygen, you would be at the physiological equivalent of standing on a mountain higher than any mountain that currently exists on Earth. Your body would be working hard just to extract enough oxygen from each breath to keep your basic systems running. Your brain would be slow. Your muscles would fatigue within seconds of real exertion. Any process in your body that requires sustained high energy output would fail. Not catastrophically and all at once, but steadily, the way a battery drains when the demand exceeds the supply. 1% is the rough, lower estimate for atmospheric oxygen during parts of the boring billion. Some researchers put it slightly higher, perhaps 2 or 3% of modern levels during certain periods. The proxies are imperfect. Ancient rock does not come with a gauge. But the range that most of the geochemical evidence points to is somewhere between 1 and 4% of what oxygen levels are today. And even the higher end of that range represents a world of profound oxygen scarcity by any standard a complex organism would recognize. The reason this matters is not atmospheric. You do not have to breathe to be affected by low oxygen. You have to exist. Every multicellular organism alive today, every organism made of more than one cell, performing specialized functions in coordination, requires oxygen not just as a gas to inhale, but as an electron acceptor in cellular respiration. The mitochondria inside your cells are running a continuous chemical process that depends on a steady supply of oxygen to function. The more cells an organism has, the more coordinated metabolic activity it requires, the higher its oxygen demand per unit of biological complexity. A bacterium can survive on very little oxygen because a bacterium is one cell with one set of needs. An animal cannot, because an animal is millions or billions of cells working together, each of them requiring their share of the oxygen supply, each of them generating metabolic demands that the organism's systems have to meet continuously. In a world where oxygen hovers at 1 to 4% of modern levels, the ceiling for biological complexity is low, very low, low enough that the eukaryotic cell, already invented, already capable, in principle, of organizing into something larger, simply cannot build the larger thing. The energy supply is insufficient. The metabolic math does not work. This is what researchers mean when they talk about the oxygen ceiling of the boring billion. It is a threshold below which certain kinds of complexity are energetically impossible, not forbidden by any law, not prevented by any external force, simply unable to sustain themselves against the thermodynamic reality of what is available. The question that follows immediately is the one that geochemists spent decades trying to answer. If oxygen was the limiting factor, why did oxygen stay low? Life had been producing oxygen through photosynthesis for more than 1 billion years before the boring billion even began. Cyanobacteria were everywhere, in every sunlit, shallow water environment on the planet, splitting water molecules and releasing oxygen with the same biological indifference to consequences that they had always had. Why was that oxygen not accumulating? Part of the answer goes back to what the previous chapter established. The carbon-oxygen feedback system that was absorbing oxygen almost as fast as it was produced. But that system does not fully explain the persistence of low oxygen across 1 billion years. The feedbacks that maintained stability were themselves dependent on something else. Something in the chemistry of the ocean that was actively consuming oxygen and preventing it from building up in the atmosphere. That something was iron and sulfur, and a deep ocean that had not yet finished the long work of oxidizing itself. The Great Oxygenation Event, 2.4 billion years ago, had put oxygen into the atmosphere for the first time. But putting oxygen into the atmosphere is not the same as oxidizing the ocean. The ocean is vast. Its chemistry is complex. Its deep water, far from the photosynthetic activity at the surface, receives oxygen only slowly, through mixing and circulation, and it contains reduced compounds that react with that oxygen and consume it before it can accumulate. During the boring billion, geochemical evidence suggests that much of the deep ocean was still anoxic, meaning it contained little or no free oxygen. Some of it may have been euxinic, containing hydrogen sulfide, which is toxic to most complex life, and which reacts readily with the trace metals that organisms need for their biochemistry. Picture the ocean as a layered system. At the surface, where sunlight reached and cyanobacteria were active, there was some oxygen. Below the surface layer, oxygen dropped off rapidly. In much of the deep ocean, there was none, and in the boundary zones between the oxygenated surface and the anoxic deep, chemistry was happening continuously. Oxygen being consumed by reduced compounds rising from below. The two systems never quite reaching the point where the deep ocean finished oxidizing and oxygen could accumulate freely. Every molecule of oxygen that might otherwise have built up in the atmosphere was being pulled into this ongoing chemical consumption. The ocean was an oxygen sink of almost incomprehensible scale, and it would remain so until something changed. The balance between oxygen production at the surface and oxygen consumption in the depths. For 1 billion years, that balance did not change enough. But the oxygen story is only part of the ceiling. The oxygen ceiling explains why complex organisms could not sustain themselves energetically. It does not fully explain why they could not get started in the first place. Why the building of complexity was constrained even at the cellular level. Why eukaryotes existed, but did not diversify into the kinds of multicellular organisms that all the evidence of their cellular sophistication suggested they should have been capable of producing. For that part of the story, you have to go deeper into the ocean, into what its chemistry meant for the specific ingredients that life needs to build with. And those ingredients, during the boring billion, were missing in ways that had nothing to do with oxygen. Close your eyes for a moment and picture the ocean. You probably see blue, deep, open, cold at the edges and warm near the equator, full of things moving through it in every direction. Whales following migration routes they have used for millions of years. currents carrying nutrients from the deep to the surface, fish in numbers that still, despite everything we have done to reduce them, constitute a biological mass almost impossible to hold in the mind, a system of extraordinary complexity and productivity, where every layer of the water column is doing something, where every chemical reaction feeds into the next, where life has colonized every available space, from the sunlit surface to the crushing dark of the trenches. Now forget all of it. 1.2 billion years ago, the ocean looked nothing like that. It smelled nothing like that. It was not doing what that ocean does. The surface had color. Yes, likely a greenish tint from the cyanobacteria that were its most productive residents. But below the surface layer, in the vast volume of water that makes up most of what an ocean actually is, the world was alien in a way that the word alien does not quite capture. It was an ocean that could not feed what it needed to grow. Start at the surface, because that is where the story begins. In the thin layer of water where sunlight could reach, photosynthesis was happening. Cyanobacteria were doing what they had been doing for more than 1 billion years, taking sunlight and carbon dioxide and water and producing sugar and oxygen with the tireless efficiency of organisms refined by selection for longer than the mind can follow. Early eukaryotes were there too, some of them already carrying the chloroplasts that would eventually make plants possible, already experimenting with the more sophisticated forms of photosynthesis that their cellular complexity enabled. Life at the surface was, in that limited sense, active, but life at the surface requires more than sunlight and carbon dioxide. It requires nutrients, the building blocks of biological molecules, the raw materials that an organism needs to construct DNA, proteins, cell membranes, enzymes, all the machinery of a living cell. And those nutrients, in the boring billion ocean, were in short supply in ways that compounded each other into something that functioned like a ceiling of its own. Phosphorus first, because phosphorus is where the story gets specific. Phosphorus is not optional for life. It is structural. It is in DNA. It is in RNA. It is in the ATP molecules that are the universal energy currency of every living cell on Earth. Without phosphorus, you cannot build the molecules that store genetic information. Without those molecules, you cannot reproduce. Without reproduction, you are not life in any meaningful sense of the word. In the modern ocean, phosphorus enters the water primarily through the weathering of rocks on land. Rain dissolves phosphate minerals from continental surfaces. Rivers carry them to the sea, and the ocean distributes them through circulation. The process is slow, and the concentrations that result are low even in the modern world. But they are sufficient to support the extraordinary biological productivity of today's ocean. In the boring billion ocean, something was removing phosphorus from the water faster than it was arriving. The mechanism involves iron, and it is one of those cases in geochemistry where understanding one thing requires understanding several other things first. In an ocean with significant amounts of dissolved iron, phosphate binds to iron minerals and gets buried in seafloor sediment. The process is efficient. The ocean chemistry of the mid-Proterozoic, with its anoxic deep water and its elevated iron concentrations in certain zones, was running this removal process at high rates. The result was an ocean that was, in significant portions, phosphorus poor, in a way that limited biological productivity from the bottom up. Fewer organisms at the base meant less total biological activity, less organic carbon being produced and buried, less pressure on the oxygen and carbon cycles to change. The nutrient limitation reinforced the stability. The stability reinforced the nutrient limitation. Now add nitrogen. Nitrogen is the other element that life cannot do without. It is in every amino acid, which means it is in every protein, which means it is in every enzyme and structural molecule and signaling compound that any cell uses to function. The atmosphere is 78% nitrogen, but atmospheric nitrogen is in a form that almost nothing can use directly. It has to be fixed, converted into biologically available compounds by organisms that have specialized enzymes for the process. Those enzymes, the ones that fix nitrogen, require molybdenum to function. Molybdenum is a trace metal. It exists in tiny concentrations, even in the modern ocean. But those concentrations are sufficient because the modern ocean is oxidized enough to keep molybdenum in a soluble form that organisms can access. In the boring billion ocean, with its sulfidic deep water and its anoxic chemistry, molybdenum was being drawn out of the water column and buried in sediment before it could reach the organisms that needed it. Low molybdenum meant less efficient nitrogen fixation. Less efficient nitrogen fixation meant less available nitrogen in the water. Less available nitrogen meant less biological productivity. Less biological productivity meant less pressure to change anything about the system. Again, the limitation reinforced itself. This is what makes the boring billion ocean so difficult to characterize in simple terms. It was constraining life in multiple ways simultaneously. Through a web of interlocking chemical limitations where each bottleneck supported the others, phosphorus scarcity reduced productivity. Reduced productivity meant less oxygen being produced. Less oxygen meant sulfidic deep water persisted. Sulfidic deep water buried molybdenum. Buried molybdenum reduced nitrogen fixation. Reduced nitrogen fixation reduced productivity further. Around and around. For a billion years. A city under permanent rationing is one way to think about it. A city where every building permit requires materials that are allocated in quantities just sufficient to maintain what already exists. With nothing left over for expansion, the city functions. People live there. The infrastructure works. After a fashion, but nothing new gets built, because the materials for new construction are always being used up by the maintenance of what is already standing. Imagine the biological consequences of living inside that ocean. The organisms that existed during the boring billion were not simple in the way that popular accounts of early life usually suggest. The eukaryotes among them were sophisticated at the cellular level, with the internal machinery of the modern cell already largely in place. What they were not was large. They were not diverse in the way that macroscopic life is diverse, where you can see the differences with your eyes, where different body plans occupy different ecological roles, and the variety of life is visible in the landscape. They were small and similar, and spread across an ocean that was doing its best to keep them that way. Some of them were building towards something, though they did not know it. In the chemistry of an ocean that withheld what they needed, in the metabolism of cells that had to become more efficient to survive on limited resources, adaptations were accumulating that would matter enormously when conditions finally changed. The specific enzymes for processing low concentrations of nutrients, the cellular machinery for surviving in fluctuating oxygen environments, the genetic flexibility that comes from hundreds of millions of years of selection in a challenging, variable, resource-limited world. Life in the boring billion was being refined in ways that would not become visible until long after the refinement was done. But the refinement was happening at the cellular level, in a dimension of life that the ocean itself could not see. and that the rock record can only hint at. And that requires a different kind of attention to understand than anything the previous chapters have asked of you. Because while the ocean was running its chemistry of limitation, while the phosphorus was binding to iron, and the molybdenum was being buried, and the oxygen ceiling was holding firm at its low and patient level, something else was happening. Something that had nothing to do with the ocean's willingness to provide. Something that was happening regardless of what the ocean permitted, in the only space where the ocean's rules did not fully apply, inside the cell itself. And what was happening inside the cell during the boring billion is the part of this story that changes what you understand about the relationship between limitation and invention. There is a rule that runs through the history of life on Earth that nobody wrote down because nobody needed to. It does not appear in any textbook as a principle. It is not named after any scientist, but it shows up, again and again, across 4 billion years of biological history. In every context and at every scale where life has been pushed to its limits. The rule is this: constraint is not the opposite of creativity. It is the condition for it. When there is abundance, organisms use what is available. They take the easy path, the path that costs the least and returns the most, the path that the environment has already laid out for them. When there is scarcity, when the easy paths are closed and the available resources are insufficient for what the organism needs to do, something different happens. Not always, not inevitably, but often enough, and in the right circumstances. Scarcity produces solutions that abundance never would have required. The boring billion was a billion years of scarcity, and inside the cells of the organisms living through it, in a dimension too small to leave direct fossils and too important to go unnoticed forever, it was producing solutions that would eventually become the foundation of every complex organism that ever lived. Start with what the eukaryotic cell already was when the boring billion began, because the starting point matters for understanding how far it traveled. Eukaryotic cells, even in its simplest form, a remarkable piece of biological engineering. It has a nucleus, a membrane-wrapped compartment that separates the genetic material from the rest of the cell's activity, allowing DNA to be read and copied in a controlled environment while the chaotic chemistry of cellular metabolism happens outside. It has an endomembrane system, a network of internal membranes that routes proteins to the right destinations and manages the import and export of materials across cellular boundaries. It has a cytoskeleton, a dynamic scaffolding of protein fibers that gives the cell its shape, enables it to move, and allows it to physically rearrange its internal components in response to what is happening around it. And it has mitochondria. The mitochondria deserve their own moment here, not because they are new to this story, but because of what they represent in the specific context of the boring billion. Mitochondria are the descendants of ancient bacteria, engulfed by a host cell somewhere around 2 billion years ago, in one of the most consequential accidents in the history of life. The host cell did not digest them. They survived inside, continued to function, and discovered, through the blind mechanism of selection, that their interests and the interests of the host were aligned. They provided energy. The host provided protection and raw materials. The arrangement worked. In an oxygen-limited world, that arrangement was everything. The mitochondrion, running aerobic respiration inside a eukaryotic cell, is extracting energy from oxygen with a thoroughness that no other biological system can match. In a world where oxygen is scarce, where every molecule of it that crosses a cell membrane is precious, having an internal system that can extract the maximum possible energy from each molecule is not a luxury. It is the difference between a cell that can afford to do complex things and a cell that can barely sustain itself. The eukaryotic cells of the boring billion were running their mitochondria in a world that gave them less oxygen than they needed. And in response, over hundreds of millions of years, they were becoming extraordinarily efficient at using what little they had. Efficiency under scarcity is one kind of innovation, but the boring billion was driving something deeper than efficiency. It was driving the invention of new cellular strategies, new ways of organizing biological information, new approaches to the fundamental problems of how a cell survives and reproduces in a challenging world. One of those inventions was sex. Not sex in the way the word usually lands. Sex in the biological sense, which is the process of combining genetic material from two different individuals to produce offspring that carry a mixture of both. In the language of genetics, this is called recombination, and it is about making variations. An organism that reproduces asexually makes copies of itself. Mutations accumulate slowly. Evolution happens, but it happens through the patient accumulation of individual changes, each one appearing in a single lineage and spreading from there if selection favors it. An organism that reproduces sexually generates variation in every generation. Every offspring is a new combination of genetic material from two parents. A new experiment. A new set of characteristics that selection can evaluate. The rate at which useful combinations can be produced and tested is incomparably higher. The speed of evolutionary response to changing conditions increases by orders of magnitude. Sexual reproduction appears to have evolved during or around the boring billion. In early eukaryotic lineages that were under exactly the kind of chronic selection pressure that makes genetic flexibility advantageous. The precise timing is debated, as it is for most events in early eukaryotic evolution, where the fossil record is sparse and the molecular clock estimates carry significant uncertainty, but the logical connection is clear. In an ocean that was constantly challenging its residents to survive on insufficient resources, in an environment where conditions fluctuated enough to make rigid and unchanging genetics a liability, the ability to reshuffle genetic material in every generation was a profound advantage. Life invented sex as a survival strategy, because variation, when the environment is difficult and unpredictable, is worth more than consistency. Now hold that next to the eukaryotic cell with its nucleus and its mitochondria and its internal membrane systems and its cytoskeleton. Hold it next to the gradual refinement of cellular machinery that was happening across the full length of the boring billion, driven by selection pressure in a nutrient-poor, oxygen-limited ocean that had no interest in making things easy. What you are looking at is the construction of a toolkit. Every improvement in cellular efficiency was a feature that a future complex organism would depend on. Every refinement in the endomembrane system was laying the groundwork for the cell-to-cell communication that multicellular life requires. Every experiment in genetic recombination was building the variation that evolution would draw on when conditions changed and new body plans became possible. The boring billion ocean did not know it was building a toolkit. The cells inside it did not know they were building a toolkit. Selection does not know anything. It runs the same blind algorithm it has always run, keeping what works and discarding what does not, with no awareness of where the keeping and discarding is leading. But it was leading somewhere. The evidence for where it was leading comes from the fossil record of the late boring billion and the period immediately following it. By around 1 billion years ago, something called Bangiomorpha pubescens appears in the rock record of Arctic Canada. It is a red alga. Sample filamentous. Nothing that would stop you in your tracks if you saw it in a modern tide pool. But it is multicellular, organized into a structure where different cells perform different functions. And it reproduces sexually. And it is preserved in rock that is approximately 1 billion years old. One cell doing one thing is a microbe. A structure where different cells do different things is the beginning of something else. Bangiomorpha pubescens is not an animal. It is not even close to an animal. But it is a proof of concept. It is evidence that the cellular toolkit being assembled during the boring billion had reached a point where simple multicellular organization was achievable. The revolution was not visible from the outside. The ocean looked the same. The rock record showed the same flat chemical signatures. The planet, from any distance, was still doing almost nothing. But inside the cells, the most important construction project in the history of life was nearing a stage where the results would become impossible to ignore. The world seemed still because the real revolution was too small to see. A planet is not only its atmosphere and its oceans and its chemical cycles. A planet is also everything happening inside, the smallest things alive on it. And inside those cells, during the boring billion, life was quietly becoming capable of everything that followed. It just needed the world to catch up. And the world, for another few 100 million years, was not quite ready. The question that the next chapter has to answer is the one that everything so far has been building toward. If the cellular toolkit was being assembled, if the foundations of complexity were being laid, if multicellular organization was already appearing in the fossil record by 1 billion years ago, what was still holding everything back? What was the lock on the door after the key had already been made? There is a particular kind of frustration that has no good name in English. It is the frustration of having everything you need except the one thing that makes everything else usable. The degree that qualifies you for the job, but not the 3 years of experience the job requires. The money saved for the house, but not the credit history the bank wants to see. The talent that is real and the opportunity that has not arrived. Everything in place. Everything ready. And the door still closed. Biology felt that frustration for several 100 million years. By around 1 billion years ago, the eukaryotic cell had been refined for more than 1 billion years of selection in a difficult ocean. Mitochondria were running aerobic respiration with increasing efficiency. Sexual reproduction was generating genetic variation at rates that asexual organisms could not match. Simple multicellular structures were appearing in the fossil record. The cellular toolkit was developed enough that the next step, the step toward genuinely complex multicellular life, seemed to be within reach. And then it was not reached, not for hundreds of millions of years more. The question this chapter asks is not why life failed. Life was not failing. By every measure available to the organisms living through this period, they were succeeding. They were present, active, reproducing, evolving. The question is why the success they were capable of at the cellular level did not translate into the kind of success that would eventually produce animals. Why the door that the cellular toolkit was designed to open stayed closed for so long after the key existed. The answer requires holding 3 things in mind at once. Because none of them alone is sufficient, and together they form a picture that is more honest than any single cause explanation. The first lock was oxygen. Still, the previous chapter on oxygen established the ceiling. Now, that ceiling needs to be understood not just as a limit on energy availability, but as a limit on body plan possibility. A multicellular organism is not simply a collection of cells that happen to be touching each other. It is a system of cells that perform different functions. where some cells specialize for structure, others for movement, others for sensing the environment, others for reproduction. The coordination of these specialized functions requires energy, continuous and reliable energy, available not just at the surface of the organism, where oxygen can diffuse in from the surrounding water, but throughout the organism's interior. In cells that have no direct contact with the outside world, oxygen diffusion has limits. In a small organism, a few cell layers thick, oxygen from the surrounding water can reach every cell by simple diffusion. But as an organism grows larger, the interior cells move farther from the surface, farther from the oxygen supply, and diffusion becomes inadequate. The solution that large animals eventually developed is a circulatory system, a way of actively moving oxygenated fluid to cells that cannot be reached by diffusion alone. Building a circulatory system requires oxygen. Running a circulatory system requires oxygen. The genetic and developmental programs that specify the construction of complex body plans require, at every stage of their operation, the kind of energy budget that only sufficient oxygen can support. At 1 to 4% of modern oxygen levels, that energy budget was not available. The door to large, complex, internally coordinated animal life was closed by a number that was simultaneously everywhere in the environment and never quite high enough. The second lock was ecological. This one is less intuitive than oxygen, but it may be equally important. We tend to think of evolution as driven by the internal properties of organisms, their genetics, their adaptations, their competitive abilities. But evolution does not happen in a vacuum. It happens in response to the environment. And the environment includes not just the chemistry of the ocean and the level of oxygen in the atmosphere, but the ecological landscape, the web of interactions between organisms that determines what roles are available, what pressures are being applied, and what advantages are worth having. During the boring billion, the ecological landscape was flat, in the same way the rock record was flat. There were no predators large enough to exert selection pressure on their prey, to evolve faster movement, or harder shells, or more sophisticated sensory systems. There was no arms race, no escalating competition between organisms that required each to become more sophisticated to stay ahead of the other. In the modern ocean, the complexity of animal life is driven in large part by predation. The existence of something that eats you creates relentless pressure to become harder to eat, faster, better armored, more aware of your surroundings, more capable of detecting danger and responding to it. The evolutionary response to predation has driven the development of eyes, nervous systems, muscle, shells, venom, camouflage, and most of the other features that make animal life as complex as it is. In the boring billion ocean, that pressure did not exist at any significant scale. Without large predators, there was no selective advantage in having sophisticated sensory systems. Without sophisticated sensory systems, the nervous system had no reason to develop. Without the nervous system, coordinated movement had no control center. Without coordinated movement, the advantages of larger body size were limited. The ecological context that drives complexity toward higher and higher levels was absent. Life was not being pushed by its neighbors toward sophistication. It was living in a world without that kind of push. And in response, it was producing exactly the level of complexity that the push required, which was very little. The third lock was nutritional, and it connects back to what the previous chapter established about the chemistry of the boring billion ocean. Even if oxygen levels had been sufficient to power a complex body plan, And even if ecological pressure had been sufficient to select for one, the nutrients required to build and maintain complex biological structures were not reliably available. Consider what a complex multicellular organism actually needs to construct itself. The signaling molecules that coordinate development, telling each cell what to become and where to be, are proteins, which require amino acids, which require nitrogen. The structural components of cell membranes, which have to be precisely manufactured for cells to adhere to each other in the right configurations, require phospholipids, which require phosphorus. The enzymes that carry out the hundreds of biochemical reactions involved in development and metabolism require trace metals, zinc and copper and iron and molybdenum, in concentrations that the boring billion ocean was not reliably providing. The building materials for complexity were rationed. In an ocean where phosphorus was being scavenged by iron minerals, where molybdenum was being pulled into sulfidic sediments, where the cycling of essential nutrients was running below the level that complex multicellular life would require. The construction project that the cellular toolkit was designed to undertake could not be funded. Blueprint exists. Materials unavailable. Project on hold. That is a stark summary of 1 billion years of biological history. But it is an accurate one, and it raises the question that is worth sitting with. Because the question contains within it the answer to what eventually changed. If the 3 locks were oxygen, ecology, and nutrients, and if all 3 were maintained by the same interlocking system of geochemical feedbacks that characterized the boring billion, then what would it take to break that system? What would it take to push oxygen high enough to liberate enough nutrients from the chemistry that was holding them, to create the ecological disruption that would start the arms race that complexity requires? It would take something large, something planetary, something that disrupted the whole system at once, that broke the stability that had maintained the low-level equilibrium for so long that the equilibrium had come to seem like the natural state of things. The planet had exactly that kind of disruption in its future. But before the disruption came, before the long stability of the boring billion finally broke, something was changing slowly in the machinery of the planet itself. Something operating on timescales even longer than the boring billion. In the deep interior of a world that was quietly, almost imperceptibly, reorganizing itself. The tectonic engine was shifting. And when the tectonic engine shifts, everything built on top of it eventually shifts with it. Everything on the surface of this planet is temporary. The continents you live on, the ocean basins that separate them, the mountain ranges that mark where ancient collisions compressed rock into vertical relief. All of it is moving, slowly, at rates measured in centimeters per year, in increments too small to feel in a human lifetime, but enormous across geological time. The ground beneath your feet is a passenger on a tectonic plate that has been traveling across the surface of the planet for hundreds of millions of years. And it will continue traveling for hundreds of millions more. Plate tectonics is not just the process that builds mountains and causes earthquakes. It is one of the fundamental drivers of the chemical cycles that keep this planet habitable. When plates collide and mountain ranges rise, the fresh rock, exposed to the atmosphere, weathers and absorbs carbon dioxide, pulling it from the air and eventually delivering it to the ocean. When plates spread apart and volcanoes open along the rifts, carbon dioxide and other gases return to the atmosphere from the mantle. The balance between these processes, over millions and billions of years, regulates the temperature of the planet and the chemistry of the ocean. During the boring billion, the tectonic engine was running. It is always running. But the specific configuration of the continents, the arrangement of land masses and ocean basins, was doing something to the chemical cycles that helped maintain the very stability the previous chapters described. By around 1.8 billion years ago, the continents had assembled into a supercontinent that geologists call Columbia, a vast landmass surrounded by deep water, with relatively little of the shallow coastal shelf where nutrients and sunlight and biological productivity converge. Columbia eventually broke apart, its fragments drifting and then reassembling around 1 billion years ago into a new supercontinent called Rodinia. Rodinia assembled over tens of millions of years, reached something close to its maximum configuration around 900 million years ago, and then began breaking apart again. That fragmentation would eventually contribute to the conditions of the Neo-Proterozoic, the period after the Boring Billion, when the world began to change in ways it had not changed for 1 billion years. The connection between tectonic configuration and global geochemistry is real but complex, mediated through processes that are difficult to reconstruct precisely from the rock record. What the evidence does support is a pattern. As Rodinia began to break apart, the weathering of fresh rock exposed by rifting increased. More nutrients entered the ocean from eroding continental margins. New shallow water environments appeared along new coastlines. The geography of the planet was changing in ways that made the nutrient-poor, productivity-limited ocean of the Boring Billion less stable, less able to maintain the chemical equilibrium that had characterized it for so long. The carbon isotope record, which had been flat for so long that its flatness had become almost definitional, began to show movement, larger swings, excursions in the isotope values that record significant changes in the carbon cycle, in the rates of organic carbon burial, in the balance between the processes that had held the system in place. The flat line on the chart was beginning, very slowly, to develop texture. Oxygen, responding to the changes in biological productivity and carbon burial, began to rise. The rise was not linear or smooth. It was interrupted and variable, with periods of increase followed by periods of relative stasis. But the direction was changing. The ceiling that had held at 1 to 4% of modern levels for so long was developing its own instability, its own susceptibility to disruption. Something else was happening during this period that connects the tectonic story to the biological story in a way that is easy to overlook. When continents rift apart and new ocean basins form, the hydrothermal vent systems along the new spreading centers release trace metals into the ocean. Zinc, copper, iron, molybdenum, the elements that biological systems need for their enzymes and their signaling molecules and their structural components, enter the water in concentrations that can support higher rates of biological activity than the nutrient-poor, Boring Billion ocean had permitted. The ocean was being fertilized by the planet's own interior, slowly, unevenly, in ways that varied enormously across different ocean basins and different time periods. The fertilization was not a single event. It was a gradual shift in the availability of the building materials that complex life required, driven by the same tectonic processes that were changing the geography of the planet's surface. The locks were not all opening at once. They were opening one at a time, over tens of millions of years, in a sequence driven by processes operating on timescales that no organism alive during the period could perceive. But the locks were opening, and what was waiting on the other side of them? What had been waiting for hundreds of millions of years in the cells of organisms prepared by 1 billion years of limitation for exactly this moment, was ready to move. The diversity of eukaryotic fossils in the rock record begins to increase during this period. Slowly at first, the forms that appear are still microscopic, still single-celled or simple multicellular at most. But the variety of shapes, the variety of cell structures, the variety of apparent ecological strategies represented in those fossils is greater than what came before. The biological response to changing conditions was beginning to produce visible results. The ending of the boring billion was not a single event with a clear date. It was a transition, a gradual shifting from one planetary state to another that accumulated across tens of millions of years into something that looked, from the long perspective of geological time, like a door finally opening. On the other side of that door, the world was about to become unrecognizable. What followed was Snowball Earth, the catastrophic glaciations of the Neoproterozoic, the greatest ice ages in Earth's history, possibly extending ice coverage all the way to the tropics. The Ediacaran biota, the first complex multicellular organisms visible in the fossil record, soft-bodied and strange, and unlike anything that came before them. The Cambrian explosion, the geologically sudden appearance of most of the major animal body plans that still exist today. Those are stories for other times. What matters here, at the end of this chapter, is understanding what had to happen before any of them could happen. The billion years of stability that preceded them was not an obstacle to those events. It was their prerequisite. The patience of the boring billion was not accidental. It was the price of admission to everything that came after. Put yourself inside a single cell, not metaphorically, as close to literally as the imagination allows. You are surrounded by membrane, a boundary so thin that a single layer of it is invisible to any optical instrument humans built before the electron microscope. Outside that membrane is ocean, ancient and chemistry-heavy, and not particularly interested in whether you survive. Inside is everything you are, everything you can do, every capacity you have developed across the hundreds of millions of years. Your lineage has been refining itself in exactly this kind of water. You do not know you are in the boring billion. You do not know you are in anything. You are a cell. You process nutrients. You replicate your DNA. You divide when conditions permit. You have no concept of the billion years behind you or the hundreds of millions of years ahead. You have no awareness that the cellular machinery running inside you represents an accumulation of biological innovation that took longer to build than the entire subsequent history of animal life would take to unfold. You are just trying to make it through the day. And that, in the end, is the whole story. The boring billion is usually told from the outside, from the perspective of the geologist reading flat isotope curves, from the perspective of the paleontologist finding few fossils worth describing in detail, from the perspective of someone who knows what came after and is frustrated by how long it took to arrive. Told from the outside, it is a story of stasis, of a world that would not move. But there is another perspective, and it is the one that matters most for understanding what the boring billion actually was. It is the perspective of the organisms living through it, not as conscious observers with any awareness of their situation, but as biological systems responding to their environment, adapting to its demands, solving the problems it presented, and in the process of solving those problems, quietly building something that the environment itself had no intention of allowing them to build. The patience of small things is not a metaphor. It is a description of a real process. In an ocean that withheld phosphorus, cells developed more efficient mechanisms for scavenging it at low concentrations. The enzymes responsible for acquiring phosphate from the environment became more sensitive, more specific, better tuned to finding what little there was. That refinement was not wasted when conditions changed. It was inherited, carried forward in the genetic memory of lineages that eventually produced organisms sophisticated enough to build entire regulatory systems around the management of nutrient scarcity. In an ocean with an oxygen ceiling, cells developed metabolic flexibility, the ability to function across a range of oxygen concentrations, to shift between different metabolic strategies depending on what was available, became an advantage that selection reinforced across hundreds of millions of years. Modern eukaryotes are remarkably flexible in their responses to oxygen availability, capable of adjusting their metabolism in ways that reflect a very long history of living in environments where oxygen was never guaranteed. That flexibility was built during the boring billion, in cells that had no choice but to be flexible, in an ocean that provided chronic low-level challenge without the acute catastrophes that force rapid evolutionary change. The genetic architecture of eukaryotic cells was being reorganized in ways that made future complexity possible. Gene regulatory systems were becoming more elaborate, the mechanisms by which one gene controls the expression of another, the molecular switches and signals and feedback loops that allow a single genome to specify an entire organism's development, were being refined over hundreds of millions of years of selection in a challenging but survivable environment. The boring billion was, in this sense, a finishing school for the eukaryotic cell, a finishing school that taught survival, efficiency, flexibility, and the particular kind of biological robustness that comes from living for a very long time in conditions that are difficult but not lethal. Consider what that robustness meant when conditions began to change. Around 800 million years ago, as the previous chapter described, the tectonic and geochemical shifts of the late Proterozoic were beginning to loosen the chemical equilibrium of the boring billion. Oxygen levels were beginning to rise. Nutrients were becoming somewhat more available. The ecological landscape was beginning to develop the kind of variation that creates opportunities for new strategies. The organisms that were going to respond to those opportunities were not starting from scratch. They were bringing a billion years of cellular refinement to a new set of conditions. And the refinement was exactly what the new conditions required. The eukaryotic cells that existed at the end of the boring billion were, in terms of their internal machinery, already capable of multicellularity. The cell adhesion molecules that allow cells to stick to each other and recognize their neighbors were present. The signaling pathways that allow one cell to communicate its state to adjacent cells were present. The regulatory genes that could, in principle, specify different fates for different cells in a developing organism were present. All of this was present before conditions changed enough to make using it advantageous. That is the detail that most accounts of the Cambrian explosion and its precursors miss. The biological prerequisites for complex multicellular life were not developed in response to the environmental changes of the Neo-Proterozoic. They were developed during the boring billion, in a different environment, in response to different pressures, and then carried forward into the new conditions where they could finally be deployed at scale. Evolution does not plan ahead. Selection has no foresight. The cellular toolkit was not assembled in anticipation of a world with higher oxygen and more nutrients. It was assembled because it was useful in the world that existed, and it happened to be exactly what was needed for the world that came after. That is one of the most important examples in the entire history of life, of a principle that runs through biology at every scale. The preparations for the next stage of complexity are always made in the previous stage, under conditions that have nothing to do with what the preparations will eventually enable. Now, consider multicellularity directly. because it is the step between the cellular toolkit and the animal body plan. And it is a step that was being taken during the boring billion in ways that the fossil record is only beginning to reveal. Simple multicellular structures appear in the rock record during this period. Bangiomorpha pubescens. The red alga from Arctic Canada, mentioned in an earlier chapter, is the most well-known example, preserved in rock, approximately 1 billion years old, but across multiple rock formations from the late boring billion and the period immediately following it. Fossils of simple multicellular organisms are present in numbers and variety that suggest multicellularity was being experimented with across many different eukaryotic lineages. Most of those experiments went nowhere. The lineages that produced them left no living descendants recognizable today, or left descendants that remained simple and microscopic. The particular combination of cellular properties that would eventually allow one lineage to produce the diversity of animal body plans seen in the Cambrian was not the only combination being tried. It was the one that worked, given the conditions that eventually emerged. But the trying itself was important. Each experiment in multicellularity was an instance of selection, evaluating the costs and benefits of cell cooperation in the specific conditions of the late boring billion ocean. Each lineage that abandoned multicellularity was demonstrating that the benefits of cell cooperation were not yet sufficient to outweigh the costs. Each lineage that persisted was refining the mechanisms that make multicellularity stable, that prevent individual cells from defecting from cooperative arrangements in favor of their own reproduction, that maintain the integrity of a multicellular organism against the constant evolutionary pressure of its own constituent cells towards selfish behavior. The biology of cancer, in the modern world, is in part a record of those ancient experiments. The tumor suppressor genes and the signaling pathways that keep cells in their proper developmental roles, the entire apparatus of multicellular discipline, were built and refined during the period when multicellularity was first being tried and tested in an ocean that was not yet giving it significant advantage. All of this was happening in organisms too small to see, in an ocean that looked, from any distance capable of observation, like an ocean where nothing much was happening. Every animal that has ever lived on Earth, every organism that has ever had a nervous system or a muscle or a gut or an eye, is the descendant of cells that were being refined during the boring billion. The specific molecular mechanisms that allow a human embryo to develop from a single fertilized cell into 100 trillion cells of 200 different types, each in its proper place and performing its proper function, trace back through an unbroken chain of inheritance to cellular machinery that was being assembled in organisms too small to see, in an ocean that had no intention of allowing them to grow larger. Every child that has ever been born carries, in the molecular architecture of every cell in their body, the legacy of 1 billion years of patience in a world that was not ready for them yet. That is what the boring billion built. That is what the flat rock record and the low oxygen levels and the nutrient-poor ocean were. Underneath, the appearance of stasis, actually producing, and knowing that changes what the boring billion is. It is not a pause in the story of life. It is not a period of failure or waiting or biological frustration. It is the period in which the most important biological foundations of the world we live in were laid, quietly and invisibly, in organisms that had no idea what they were building. The world seemed still. The revolution was too small to see. The cells did not know they were building the engine of all complex life. They were just trying to survive another day in an ocean that would not let them grow. And sometimes, that is enough. Here is a question worth asking directly. Who decided this billion years was boring? The name did not come from the organisms living through it. They had no opinion on the matter. It did not come from any contemporaneous observer, because there was no contemporaneous observer capable of forming an opinion about geological timescales. It came from scientists working in the 20th century, looking at the rock record from this period and finding it, compared to the records from the periods immediately before and after it, relatively uneventful. Boring, in other words, is a human judgment, a comparative assessment made by minds that have been shaped by a very particular set of expectations about what counts as important. Those expectations are worth examining, because they reveal something about us that the boring billion, in its quiet way, is asking us to notice. We measure importance by disruption, by catastrophe, by the events that leave the clearest marks in the geological record. The asteroid impacts, and the mass extinctions, and the global glaciations, and the volcanic episodes that rewrote the chemistry of the ocean and the atmosphere in geologically brief intervals. Those events are dramatic. Their signatures in the rock are unmistakable. They announce themselves. The boring billion does not announce itself. Its signature in the rock is the absence of announcement. The flat carbon curves, the stable isotope ratios, the chemical equilibrium that persisted for so long that it left a record of its own persistence, which looks, to a mind trained to look for disruption, like nothing. But consider what the word boring actually requires to be accurate. Boring means devoid of interest, lacking in features that reward attention, a thing you could turn away from without missing anything of consequence. By that definition, the boring billion is one of the least boring intervals in the history of this planet, because what was happening inside its apparent stillness, the assembly of the eukaryotic toolkit, the refinement of cellular machinery across hundreds of millions of years, the first experiments in multicellularity, the slow accumulation of biological capability that would eventually produce every complex organism that ever lived, is among the most consequential processes that have ever operated on Earth. The boring billion is boring only if you are not paying attention to the right things. And that, as it turns out, is a very human problem. We are organisms that evolved to respond to events, to disruptions, to changes in the environment that required immediate response. The ancestral human mind was shaped by selection to notice the predator moving at the edge of the field, the sudden sound in the dark, the unexpected change in the landscape that might signal danger or opportunity. It was not shaped to notice the slow accumulation of invisible progress in systems operating below the threshold of perception. We notice what is loud. We remember what is dramatic. We call things boring when they do not register in the categories our nervous systems were built to track. The geological record of the boring billion is quiet because the most important things happening during it were happening at the scale of molecules and cells. The revolution was subcellular. The progress was molecular. The changes that mattered were happening at a scale so far below the threshold of any possible observation that they left no direct trace in the rock, only indirect evidence in the chemistry and the eventual appearance of what those changes made possible. A revolution at the scale of a cell is not legible to a species that measures importance in the scale of continents. This is not a failure of science. Science has done extraordinary work in reconstructing what happened during the boring billion, in reading the molecular traces in living cells that connect the organisms of today to their Proterozoic ancestors, in extracting geochemical signals from billion-year-old rock that point toward what the conditions of that ocean were like. The picture is incomplete, and it will remain incomplete, because the fossil record from this period is genuinely sparse and the chemical signals genuinely ambiguous. But the picture is real. The revolution was real. The cellular innovations of the boring billion were real. And they mattered. In ways that the word boring simply does not accommodate. What the boring billion requires of us is a different relationship with the idea of progress itself. Progress, in the way we usually use the word, is visible. It is measurable by outcomes that can be observed, by structures that can be pointed to, by changes in the landscape that register in the kinds of records we know how to read. A species appears in the fossil record. A technology is invented. A civilization rises. These are legible forms of progress. They announce themselves. The progress of the boring billion was the kind that only becomes visible in retrospect, that can only be recognized as progress once you know what it led to. That was, during the time it was happening, indistinguishable from stasis. This is not unusual in the history of life. Many of the most important transitions in biology were invisible while they were occurring. The accumulation of mutations in a lineage that eventually produces a new body plan looks, at any given moment, like normal variation. The slow refinement of a developmental pathway that eventually enables a new kind of organism looks, at any given moment, like ordinary evolution. The significance only becomes apparent at the end, when you can look back at the accumulated changes and see where they led. The boring billion is the longest example of this pattern in Earth history. 1 billion years of progress that did not look like progress. 1 billion years of becoming that did not look like change. 1 billion years of building something that the rock record, by its nature, was not equipped to record. Boring is what we call things we do not yet know how to read. The boring billion was not boring. It was written in a language that we are only now beginning to understand. And what it says, in that language, is something that the next chapter is going to ask you to sit with. Because the pattern the boring billion represents, the pattern of invisible preparation in conditions of constraint, of progress that does not look like progress until the moment it becomes impossible to miss, is not a story that ended 1 billion years ago. It is a pattern that anyone who has ever waited for something knows from the inside. And the question is whether, now that you have traveled the full length of this story, the room where you started feels different than it did when you first walked in. Go back to the room, the one from the beginning of this story, the one where you had done everything right, prepared everything, built everything you were supposed to build, and then sat down and waited for something that did not come. The door that did not open, the phone that did not ring. You are in that room again now. But you have been somewhere in between. You have been to a cliff face in northern Australia, where the rock remembered 1 billion years of almost nothing. You have been to an ocean that withheld the basic ingredients of complexity from the organisms that needed them. You have been inside a cell too small to see, watching machinery being assembled that the cell itself had no idea it was building. You have followed 1 billion years of invisible work to the moment when the world finally changed, when the locks opened one by one, when the cellular toolkit that had been assembled in silence was deployed in an environment that was at last ready to use it. You have seen what the room looked like from a distance of 1 billion years, and now you are back inside it. The question this chapter is asking is not a scientific one. The science is done. The carbon isotopes have been read. The oxygen proxies have been measured. The fossil record has been examined as carefully as a billion-year-old rock record allows. The question this chapter is asking is simpler and harder than any of that. Does the room feel different now? Because the room has not changed. The door is still closed. The phone is still not ringing. The world outside is still moving at its own pace, indifferent to whatever is happening inside. All of the external conditions that made the room feel like a room where nothing was happening are exactly as they were. What has changed is what you know about rooms like this one. You know now that the most consequential processes in the history of life on Earth were not the ones that announced themselves. They were the ones that ran quietly, below the level of any possible observation, in conditions that looked from the outside like nothing was happening. The eukaryotic cell did not become capable of producing animal life during a period of abundance and expansion. It became capable during a period of constraint, in an ocean that was doing everything a planetary chemistry system could do to keep things exactly as they were. The preparation happened in the waiting. That is not a comfortable thought if you are sitting in the room right now. It does not resolve the discomfort of a door that will not open. It does not shorten the wait or guarantee what is on the other side. The boring billion did not guarantee anything either. Most of the multicellular experiments that were tried during it failed. Most of the lineages that existed at the beginning of it left no recognizable descendants at the end. The preparation was real and thorough and consequential. And most of the things that were prepared did not survive to use what they had built. Preparation is not a promise. It is what happens while you wait for conditions that may or may not arrive. What the boring billion holds, honestly, is both things at once. A billion years of genuine constraint, of organisms that were genuinely limited, of a world that was genuinely not ready. And inside that same billion years, the most consequential biological preparation in Earth history. The patience was not a choice. It did not come with a guarantee. Some of what waited did not survive to use what it built. That is also true, and it lives in the rock record, alongside everything else this story has told you. But here is what the boring billion adds to that picture that the room, on its own, does not contain. The cells that were being refined in the boring billion ocean were not aware of what they were building. They had no concept of preparation, no understanding of their own situation, no ability to recognize the difference between a period of invisible progress and a period of genuine stagnation. They could not tell the difference because they had no way of seeing their own process from the outside. They were inside it, entirely and without perspective, doing what the immediate environment required of them. You are not inside it without perspective. You have a perspective that no cell in the boring billion ocean could ever have had. You can look at what happened and see the pattern. You can recognize that what looked like stasis from the outside was, from the inside of the cells living through it, the full and complete work of becoming. You can hold in your mind simultaneously the flatness of the rock record and the revolution happening beneath it, the apparent stillness of a billion years and the extraordinary biological complexity being assembled inside that stillness. You can see both at once. The cells could not. That capacity, the capacity to hold both perspectives simultaneously, to see your own situation from the outside while living through it from the inside, is itself one of the things that the boring billion eventually produced. It required everything that came after the boring billion to build. The Cambrian animals and their nervous systems, the vertebrates and their increasingly complex brains, the long line of creatures that eventually produced a species capable of reading billion-year-old rock and reconstructing from its chemistry what the world was like before memory existed. The perspective you are using right now to think about the boring billion is a product of the boring billion. The capacity to recognize invisible preparation is itself the result of invisible preparation. There is something quietly vertiginous about that if you follow it all the way through. The awareness that allows you to understand the boring billion, to see the pattern of constraint and invisible progress and eventual transformation, was built by the same process it is now being used to examine. The tool and the subject are the same thing. looked at from different ends of a billion years. What the boring billion cannot tell you is which kind of room you are in. What it can tell you is that rooms that look identical from the outside, rooms with closed doors and unanswered phones and no visible sign of progress, can contain very different things depending on what is happening below the level that the rock record, or any external record, can see. The cells in the boring billion ocean could not see themselves clearly enough to know which kind of room they were in. They just kept doing what the immediate environment required of them, as well as they could, in conditions that were difficult and persistent, and not particularly interested in their survival. Most of them did not make it. One lineage did. And from that one lineage, every complex organism that has ever lived on Earth descended. The room the boring billion sat in for a billion years was the same room at the end as it was at the beginning. The door opened, not because anything inside the room changed dramatically, but because the world outside it finally shifted into a configuration that the room's long preparation had made it ready for. The door opened because both things were true at once. The world was finally ready, and the life inside it had spent a billion years becoming ready too. You are back in your room now, the one this story started in. The door is the same door. The silence is the same silence. But you are not the same person who sat down at the beginning. And sometimes, in rooms like this one, that is the only thing that needed to change. You are breathing right now. The same instruction this story opened with. The same physical act. Your diaphragm pulling down. Your lungs expanding. Air moving through passages your body has been maintaining since before you were aware of having a body. The oxygen in that air, crossing membranes thin enough to feel like nothing, entering your blood, being carried to the cells that need it, being used by mitochondria to produce the energy that keeps every biological process in you running. The same breath, a different weight. The oxygen in your lungs right now did not always exist at this concentration. The 21% that your body is calibrated to expect, that the entire biology of complex animal life is built around, was not a feature of this planet for most of this planet's history. It is a recent development. It is the result of a process that took billions of years to complete, and that spent roughly a billion of those years locked in a chemical equilibrium that prevented it from progressing. The oxygen your cells are using right now passed through the boring billion on its way to you. The concentration that makes your existence possible accumulated across a timescale that began before animals existed, paused for a billion years in the mid-Proterozoic, when every mechanism that might have allowed it to build up was being cancelled by the same planetary equilibrium that held everything else in place. And then finally, as the tectonic and geochemical shifts of the late Proterozoic loosened the locks, accumulated to the levels that complex life required, every cell in your body is the descendant of cells that survived the boring billion. The mitochondria running aerobic respiration in your cells right now are the descendants of bacteria that were incorporated into eukaryotic cells somewhere around 2 billion years ago. They carried their aerobic metabolism through the full length of the boring billion, running their electron transport chains in an ocean that gave them less oxygen than they needed, refining their efficiency across hundreds of millions of years of selection in conditions of scarcity. They are more efficient today, partly because of the boring billion. The pressure of operating near the limits of what the available oxygen could support drove refinements in mitochondrial function that are still present in every cell inside you. Every time your cells extract energy from oxygen, they are doing it with machinery that was sharpened by a billion years of resource limitation in an ancient ocean. The gene regulatory networks that directed the development of your body from a single cell into the particular biological structure that you are traced back through an unbroken chain of inheritance to the regulatory systems being elaborated in eukaryotic cells during the boring billion. The molecular switches and signals that make complex multicellular development possible were not invented in the Cambrian or the Ediacaran. They were invented earlier, in organisms too small to see, in conditions that required them to be invented for reasons that had nothing to do with building a body. They were invented anyway, because that is what selection does. It keeps what functions, regardless of what it will eventually be used for. And over a long enough time, functional things accumulate into capabilities that no single moment of selection could have anticipated. You are the accumulation of 1 billion years of invisible work. You are reading these words with a brain that required to exist. The sequence of steps that began before the boring billion started and ran through it without interruption. Through the flat rock record, and the oxygen ceiling, and the nutrient-poor ocean, and the locked door, and the slow tectonic loosening of conditions that had held for so long they seemed permanent. The permanence was not permanent. The stability that looked like stasis was a stage. The longest stage in the biography of complex life on Earth, but a stage nonetheless. It ended. The conditions that had maintained it eventually shifted beyond the capacity of the feedback systems to compensate. Oxygen rose. Nutrients became available. The ecological landscape developed the complexity that drives evolutionary change. The cellular toolkit, assembled across the full length of the boring billion, was finally deployed in an environment that could support what it was capable of building. The first animal that ever had an eye opened it into a world that the boring billion made possible. Everything it could see, every shape and shadow and movement in the water around it, was built on foundations laid in an ocean that would not let anything grow. The eye itself, the nervous system behind it, the body carrying both, traced every one of its components back to cells that had spent 1 billion years becoming capable of exactly this, in conditions that gave them no reason to expect it would ever arrive. All of it rests on what was built when nothing seemed to be happening. The question the boring billion leaves you with is not geological. It is not about isotope ratios or tectonic reconstruction or the specific mechanisms by which phosphorus limitation constrained biological productivity in the mid-Proterozoic ocean. Those things are real and they matter, and this story has tried to do them justice. The question is about what you do with the pattern. The pattern of a world that has what it needs at the cellular level, but not yet the conditions to deploy it. The pattern of invisible progress in an environment that is not yet ready for the visible kind. The pattern of 1 billion years of patience producing the foundation for a transformation that the patience itself could never have predicted or intended. You are in a world built by that patience. You are made of cells that practiced it for longer than the mind can honestly hold. For 1 billion years. The question was why life stayed small. The answer, at the end of this long journey through the chemistry and the geology and the cellular biology of an ancient world, is not that life failed. It is not that the planet failed. It is that the world was not yet ready. And life, without knowing it, spent 1 billion years getting the world ready. And then the world was ready. And nothing was ever the same. Take a breath. Feel the oxygen cross into your blood. You are the long consequence of the longest patience in the history of this planet. And somewhere in the shallow coastal waters of a world that no longer exists, in an ocean that would not give what life needed to grow, cells too small to see were doing the only thing available to them. They were keeping going. They had no idea it was enough. It was everything.